Great. Thanks so much, Patricia. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us today. What a fantastic turnout. My name is Jennifer Rose, and I wear multiple hats. As you can see, I work for an organization called Inspire Action for Social Change, where I'm co-founder and director, and a lot of our work is geared around supervised visitation and safe exchange and sort of post-separation needs for families who've experienced domestic violence. And I also work as a consultant for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, which I enjoy and has brought me here with you all today. So really excited to be here, really excited to be having this conversation. Just to get us started, my hope for today is, that we can engage in as much of a conversation as we can by way of a webinar. So I want to encourage folks to please type in the chat box. I'll do my best to get to your questions. There's always opportunities to follow up if other big things come up. And that my approach to understanding domestic violence in the context of families also in child welfare is just to help us get at some of our biases and beliefs, to get at some of the myths and understand some of the challenges that come up for us, to have a better understanding of the needs and experiences of people who've experienced violence as well as people who use violence, and then, of course, children who are exposed to the violence that's happening in their homes, and both the direct violence they might experience as well as some of the violence they experience by being used by a parent who uses violence as a way to get at their partners. We'll kind of unpack all of that together and sort of explore really the complexities. I come to this work, I've been doing anti-violence work for over 25 years, and I've grown so much since I started and really used to be one of those very righteous advocates who saw it in black and white, and have really come to see that these issues are so gray and complex, and that the human experience has to be understood in much more nuanced ways, and that the families who are coming to us are really coming to us not at the best moments in their lives, but in some of the most complicated and challenging times, and that the more empathy we can sort of build for those experiences, I think the more effective we are in whatever role that we bring. And as I've been watching you all sign in, we have everyone from advocates to the courts to lawyers, child welfare workers. And so just to get more clear about who is with us today, we're going to do a quick poll, and I apologize if you are not listed directly on this poll, but just want to get a sense of who's in the room. So we're going to put up a poll and give you a minute just to let us know where you're coming from. Patricia? Many of you are typing in, and if folks also want to just, if you see your box up there, click it. Just gives me a perspective and one snapshot of who's on the line with us. Great. Take another minute. I see people still filling it out. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Just in a broad stroke, it looks like we have quite a few social workers on the line with us, domestic violence advocates, legal professionals, policymakers, supervised visitation, therapists, a few folks who are working with people who use violence. Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here today, and I hope that you'll continue to engage in this conversation with me for the next 90 minutes or so. Next quick poll, I just want to get a sense of, have you had formal domestic violence training? I like to use a little levity. Don't be shy if you don't know what DV is. Excellent. Let's just take another minute. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Excellent. thank you all who participated. So it looks like a good percentage of folks have had some formal domestic violence training. I'm really glad to see that. I got my MSW a number of years ago and was just really taken by the fact that there was no domestic violence training or education as part of my schooling, and just recognizing how prevalent domestic violence is, particularly in the lives of families, that those of us training to do social work. And so I'm glad to see that more of you have had it, and over the years I've had a lot of conversations with folks around DV training, and it's certainly something folks are always asking for more of. And I think that, for me, I feel I know less now, 25 years later, than I did when I started. It's sort of an evolving understanding, and really also remembering that each person's unique experience is relevant to their lives and not necessarily just what we might learn in the book. So hopefully we'll do some exploration of that today. So just quick, some of our goals. Hopefully we can build a shared understanding, again, sort of unpack some of our common myths and misconceptions of domestic violence and battering, kind of making the connections to how those relate to our then everyday practice and policy. And in the end, really explore some strategies. How can you as individuals in your work, my hope is at the end of our time, choose one thing that you can go and change as a result of the thinking and learning that we do together. So I think it's important to get started that we all have sort of a baseline of where we're starting when we're defining domestic violence, right? And so when we're talking about domestic violence, we're talking about a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior, right? And what we know about violence is that in some families, there may be an incident of violence that happens, and that incident may even get them into our system or into our systems. But that when we're talking about domestic violence and battering, I think it's important that we recognize, rather than thinking of just incidents or single events, well, we want to address those, and those are never okay. What we're talking about in our work is really more about a pattern of behaviors, right? So a pattern of coercive and controlling behaviors that could be emotional, sexual abuse, financial abuse, obviously physical abuse and entitlement. And again, it's not something that happens once, but that it's really something that happens as a pattern of behaviors. And I think about this woman who I worked with many years ago, and she said, if I were to describe this to you, this is how I would describe it. If we were all in this room and a grain of sand fell, no one would notice. But if 10, 20, 30, 100 grains of sand started to fall, we still maybe wouldn't notice. But then one day it's like waking up in the desert, right? And all of a sudden you're buried. And so the things that we then ask people who've experienced violence to do, or to, we tell people to leave or to just sort of move on, we have to recognize that those grains of sand happen over time, and that once you're in the desert, it's a lot more challenging and more complicated, and that those grains of sand, the constant grains of sand that fall, are those patterns, are those ongoing efforts to maintain power and control of that intimate partner. I think, too, especially in child welfare work, and when supervised visitation as well, when we're thinking about working with men, women, and children simultaneously, and even in our DV programs, right? When people come through the door, we often can have someone who, is the survivor of violence come, and then the person who's used violence also come and describe their own victimization. And so when we're thinking about it, some things to explore to better understand who is the person needing protection. It's not to say that both people maybe haven't used violence, because what we know is that people fight back, people resist, all of those things happen. But when we're trying to identify the person who needs protection, this idea of whose world is getting bigger and whose world is getting smaller has always been really helpful for me, right? So a person who's using violence and using power and control to maintain, what's happening in their family, to have control, right? Their world, at least it may appear to be getting bigger. They're getting more control. And that person who is, experiencing violence and power and control and sort of having their self-esteem and their self-worth chipped away at, who's feeling isolated, right? Their world is getting smaller. So when you're listening to people describe their experiences, be thinking about, has this person's world been getting bigger? And how has this other person's world potentially been getting smaller, as a way to kind of help sift through the complexities of domestic violence and the experiences in families. And Fear is a huge one. What I've often hear from, when I've done orientations, I'm getting to know people, and both people have described some level of violence. Right? I'm looking at, are both people fearful of one another, or is there one person who has more fear? And not just physical fear, but fear of the world getting smaller, fear of not being able to make choices, fear of not being able to talk about what's happening for them, fear of losing. As we think about child welfare, what we know about survivors of domestic violence is one of their greatest fears is losing their children. And we know people who use violence often use that as a strategy, as a threat to maintain power and control in their relationship. And again, choices, right? These sort of ties into sort of bigger, smaller. Who feels like they have choices? Who has choices to make different decisions, to go different places, to get help, has access? So these are things we can be considering as we're talking and trying to unpack, who needs protection, who is the person who is using power and control in this relationship, and who is the person at risk. I like sitting in the room with folks, and I think that self-reflection for me is one of the key ways that we, one, take care of ourselves, right? The more we know ourselves, the more we know our biases and beliefs and where they come from and those types of things. I think our longevity in this work is maintained, as well as a better understanding of the things that we need to be paying attention to. So I just wanted to have folks just a moment, grab a piece of paper. And if you think about 3 things you think survivors of domestic violence should do, right? And some of you may be in a room full of other people. Some of you are probably alone. So I encourage you to just be really honest. And if you can't be totally honest about your own sense, like, what do you hear? Like, what is the sort of more common beliefs of what survivors of domestic violence should do? And then while you're doing that, I want you to just consider, where did those beliefs come from? Where did you learn that? And again, sort of last, just a moment of reflection. How do you think some of those things impact your work? And let's just take a moment for folks to do that. And if you're brave and you'd like to chat it in the chat box and share with the group, we'd love to hear it. And really the purpose of this is just to give you each a moment to sort of get a baseline of where you're at and where your thinking is. Thanks, Courtney, for sharing that, and others. Right, so things like they should leave, right? We think survivors should leave. They should access the courts. Thanks, Ronnie, right? Violence really thrives in secrecy. We think they should report it. They should do something. Safety plan, passports. Find their own inner strength. Seek out help. Create a safety plan. Yvette, closed captioning should be available. We're working on that. Thanks for sharing all these. I'd ask folks too, so where did they come from? Where did those beliefs come from? Get support. They should know it's not their fault. We were thinking they'd already left the situation since it says survivor. Thanks for that, right? Those are our own assumptions that get tied into the things we think they should do. And as folks are still typing in, just want to move to this place of reflection. Folks, think about how these beliefs impact then how you work with survivors, with children, with people who use violence. Let's take another moment for folks. My white middle-class suburban culture and my mom's belief that she shared with me. Thanks, Courtney, for sharing that. They should really do what they feel is safe doing. I'm more apt to believe that survivor as a result of my lifestyle. Don't be ashamed. My own experience has guided my beliefs along as well as the way I was raised. Thanks, Candace. I think sometimes our assumptions can hinder more than help. Appreciate that, Ramon. Thanks for sharing all of these folks. And you know, I imagine people reading them feel similarly, right? And I take this opportunity because, you know, we all bring our own stuff to this work. And one thing that I think is most important is that we realize that most of us who do, are social workers or advocates or attorneys or in the courts or working with people who use violence or kids, this work, we bring our whole selves, you know, and who we are from 9 to 5 isn't all that different than who we are for the rest of the time we're around. Most of us are advocates in our everyday life. Many of us on this call have either experienced violence in our own relationships as children, know somebody, absolutely everybody does, not only the people you work with, but people who are close to you. So it's always important that we remember we bring our own stuff, and that if we're not looking at it, unpacking it, and exploring it, it can, as someone said, you know, get in the way of our ability to be non-judgmental, to really hear from survivors, from children, and even from people who have their own experience that helps us be better at our work. And so a reminder and an honoring of those on the line who have had this experience and have chosen to help others, and to all of you who have chosen to do this work that's so important, not only in transforming safety for families, but for our communities. So I'm going to take a moment here, and thank you all for sharing, to share a short video. And this is Rachel's story. And for me, this was created by Praxis International, and it was created as a part of a child welfare project. And what Rachel's story really illustrates is what it is we ask of survivors who are not only managing fear and risk, or trying to have everyday realities of being a mom and or parent and with a family, kids' needs, you know, the fact that people who use violence, they continue to be in their lives in one way or another, and that it's just far more complex. And this is just a moment to ground ourselves in the lived experience, and we're using Rachel as that example. So once again, you can only hear this through your computer, so I apologize to those of you who have called in, but we will have the sound back as soon as the audio is over, and I'm going to hit play. Thanks, everybody. So just take a minute, sort of watch that video. What were some general responses? What came up for folks? Tim, thanks for your comment. Fantastic. What do you think about Rachel or Catalin or those kids? All too common? It seems like a typical client. Yep, really very real. All the other challenges and barriers. Can you hear me? Sounds like maybe we're having some sound issues. Is that better? Patricia, keep letting me know if it's not working. I hope that's better. So I see a lot of comments about this is all too common, this is very real, there's so many things that they're juggling. And I just invite us, as we're kind of listening, as we spend the next hour together, that we hold Rachel's story, right, and that experience and that overwhelm that we can clearly see she felt, and that every time I watch it, I feel anxious. My heart starts racing about just all of the expectations that we have of survivors who enter into our system. And I think one of the most important things to remember is that you're seen as the system, regardless whether you are a visitation program or an advocate or in child welfare or the courts or any of those different interveners that are in people's lives, we never know what people's experience was prior to getting to us, and that they bring that experience and that they lump us all together, that families do. And so just a reminder that how can we start fresh, how can we hold whatever that experience is, and how important it is that we all are offering a more seamless response, that we are working together collaboratively as a community so that that experience is more seamless, and that we recognize all of the things we're asking people to do. And that this video doesn't even get at issues around culture, around communities of violence, of what it means to be a Black woman involved in the system versus what it might look like to be a white woman or Latina or someone who's undocumented, and sort of that layer that then becomes a part of this conversation that we have to hold on to and remember that that experience can be even more complex. So I'm hoping my sound is a little bit better now, and I'm appreciating the comments there. And I just want to say one last thing about Rachel's video. That video is available through Praxis International, and you can go to their website and you can order it, because I do think it's a great tool for our communities to come together and sort of think about these experiences and how we can work together. So let's look a little bit at some myths as a way to unpack our understanding and sort of then the implications it has for our work, right? And many of you, when I asked, what survivors should do, said they should leave their relationship, right? And I think we hold this belief that adult victims of domestic violence are safer once they leave. And while for some, they may be safer, but what we also know is that leaving is the most dangerous time for many survivors. And we know that from hearing their stories. We know that from the statistics. And so in our work, when we are requiring people to leave, or that is the assumption we have about what will keep them safer, we have to remember that sometimes we're asking folks to do the very thing that can put them in greater risk. And that sometimes, in child welfare, when they're children, this all gets very complex. I think we have to recognize that it isn't always safer to leave, and that we're going to spend a little time looking at risk and a risk analysis once we get through these myths that will illustrate really that sometimes the risks of leaving are as great as the risks of leaving, and that we want to figure out how to work individually with each survivor, with each adult victim, to better understand their experiences and their choices, and that recognizing sometimes inadvertently we are requiring people to do things that put them at greater risk. And so the greater our partnership with survivors of domestic violence and their families to figure out what they feel will keep them safest is really key to supporting, that level of safety in people's lives, and recognizing that physical safety isn't always sort of the most prevalent safety need that a survivor might have. Myth 2, mothers choose their abusive partners over protecting their children. And I think this ties into that, this idea we have then is if she stays in that relationship, that she's choosing the abusive partner over protecting her kids. From the thousands of women I've sat with, sometimes staying felt like the best way to support the safety of her children. She felt that she could keep better track of what was happening. What we know is that not all of our systems are perfect, and that when someone is the risky parent, sometimes those children end up in the custody of that person who's caused harm to their family. Sometimes they're allowed access, unsupervised access, even if it's not custody. And sometimes it backfires. So I think it's important for us to look at this myth and understand that survivors stay for all kinds of reasons. And most often, and right, I never say all, most stay to protect their children. And that the dynamics of domestic violence in a relationship are often such that it's not always violent, that there isn't always that level of power and control. And I think we have to remember that these are two people who are in a loving relationship, and sometimes there is love in that relationship, and that it's far more complex, right? And so when we believe that a mother's choosing their abusive partner over protecting their kids, I think we then see her in a particular way. And I think it's hard for any of us, whether you have children or not, to imagine a parent choosing anything over their children. I'm the mother of a 7-year-old, and I couldn't imagine. And that's for me, and I have to understand that women who are in abusive relationships, or all women, make choices based on their lived experience, and we want to better understand that. But when we have these assumptions or these beliefs, we can be putting people in more risk, and we can be missing really key pieces of someone's experience that can help us be in better partnership with them, that can help them stay safer and keep their children safe. This sort of comes up in the Rachel video, right? This idea of like client increasingly uncooperative, right? If I were Rachel, I would probably be uncooperative too, and that it would be complex, and that when we're asking women to navigate and think about your unique community, some communities have good public transportation, some communities have horrible public transportation, some people have cars, some people don't. What it means to get from point A to point B can sometimes take 3 or 4 hours, and then you imagine this person with 2 or 3 small children trying to navigate to get from A to B, to jump through all of our hoops, to do all the things we're asking them to do. And that when they just decide to stay home, or when they decide to just go get ice cream instead of doing the thing we ask them to do, we label people in a particular way. And I think it's important for us to recognize that web. I always bring that web up in my head of Rachel's, the things she's asked to do, the steps of each of the systems that she's intervening in, all of those different pieces. Because when we see mothers as lazy or disorganized or unwilling to comply, then we're able to make decisions about their lives that sometimes can cause more risk, that really sometimes miss the complexity and the challenges, and sometimes put people in more risk, right, if we don't understand how challenging it is. And once people are in the system, we know people are under a microscope, and things that maybe you and I can do or that wouldn't be considered lazy or disorganized, people who are system involved, people who are living in poverty, people who have experienced violence often get labeled in these particular ways. And I think we can sometimes write them off, and we can sometimes miss really important things and the strengths that they bring. I always believed that, when she walked through the door, especially when I was running a supervised visitation program, that she has done a tremendous job. She is here, and she has kept her kids safe. And maybe it isn't exactly the way I would do it or the way I would hope it to be, but she has done it, and that is a tremendous strength. And how do we start from those strengths, from those assets that people have, to better figure out how to support them in their lives and in the complexities? And again, I think I mentioned, I came to this work very black and white, and I think the greatest gift we can give ourselves is to learn how to be in the gray, because it isn't clear and black and white, and everybody's life comes with its own experiences that we want to figure out with them and not for them all the time. I think this is important too. All violence is not the same. I'm in no way condoning violence at any level, but all violence is not the same. And the context of the violence in people's lives is so essential, right? I see that. Thanks, Scott. I missed myth 4. And I just skipped to myth 5. That was poor numbering. But this is a big one. This will be 4 and 5. So, right, this idea that all violence is the same. And that violence in people's lives is really contextual, and we want to understand for each family what it's meant, what it's looked like. I think sometimes, when we start talking about women's use of violence, well, there are certainly women who use violence in relationships. I think when we lump that violence as the same as men's violence against women, right? Because what we know about violence against women and girls is that that we can't miss the gender-based nature of that crime, of how that happens, of what it looks like systematically, politically, socially. So we can't miss those particular components. And so when we have a blanket response, then we miss opportunities to build on strengths. We miss opportunities to better understand the context of the violence in people's lives, to have interventions and supports that are more relevant in people's lives. So I think it's really important that even the same act of violence in 2 different families may have different meaning. And so we have to be able to tailor our response. We have to be able to listen and understand what that particular act meant in a particular family based on their experiences, who's using the violence, what that looks like. And I think this is just particularly important for us to not lose, right, and to not lose the context of violence and not lose that there is gender-based violence that is a large-scale social problem, and that there is violence that happens in relationships, and that we have to understand those for what they are within the context of where they are. So let's see, could you be more specific and give an example? So in a relationship where, and it also, this often comes up, often when I talk about violence against women and girls, and people say, well, I know this man who was abused by his wife. And I'm not to say that that doesn't happen, but then I often try to get at these things around whose life is smaller, whose life is getting bigger, what does fear look like, how is that violence supported? Women's use of violence is not supported in the same way as men's use of violence. In terms of how socially and politically that violence is accepted and perpetuated. And so that's an example. Or sort of more specific example, in one family, I saw this a lot in supervised visitation, there were unique triggers, right? And they could be anything from pizza to a stuffed animal, right? And in one family, you may not, dad brought a teddy bear. Well, that would be sweet. But in another family, a dad brings a teddy bear, and we don't know that actually that teddy bear has significance because that teddy bear was used either as a strategy for violence, or every time abuse happened, daddy brought home teddy bears. And so we have to recognize that these acts, and those aren't maybe physical violence, but those are ways that emotional violence comes in, that we want to be paying attention to, that not everything means the same thing in every family. So we want to be paying attention to how things might be different. And absolutely, Talia, we don't want to forget about financial abuse. And financial abuse is huge. And what we know is that for people who want to leave and feel like they can't, financial abuse is often a very strong anchor for those people, right? Because whether it means changing a lifestyle or socioeconomic class, or even just having basic needs met. Sometimes the person who is primarily bringing in the resources for that family, it can be a huge reason why people stay, and a way that people maintain power and control in ways that we don't even see or know about unless we sort of get a clear understanding of what's happening in people's lives. So absolutely, it's a huge piece. And living on the street versus living in a home where there's sometimes violence, we can all sort of take a moment and reflect on the choices we might make. And it seems maybe like it would be crystal clear, but it's really far more complicated. And so that's where some of these other ways that violence happens. And what I know in my work is physical violence absolutely happens. And typically, if you're in child welfare, by the time a family gets to you, there has been sort of a higher level of violence. But what I heard from many women I sat with is that it wasn't the physical violence that was the most painful, right? It was the emotional violence. It was the lack of control. It was the financial abuse, the inability to sort of get their feet on the ground, and the slow chipping away of self-worth and self-esteem that was far harder to heal, and that far fewer of us in the system actually were able to see. And so it's important that we recognize that sometimes those bruises and broken arms, those are the most tangible for us, but the other type of violence that happens, the emotional, the financial, the psychological and emotional abuse, can be far more damaging for some folks. So I think, often in talking about domestic violence, we talk about survivors and what survivors need, and barriers to leaving and what violence looks like. And I've come to see that, we have missed a really important part of our work, which is working with people who use violence. And I have here men who use violence, and that's not to negate that violence doesn't happen in same-sex relationships, that women don't use violence, and so I'm not taking any of that away, but just for the purpose here of what we see as more prevalent, right? And the category of people who we have spent far less time engaging with and working with and finding different types of interventions. I'd love to hear from folks, why is it important to work with men who use violence? And I see some comments here, men's attitudes, entitlement must change. to stop them from showing others that it's okay to use violence. They're a huge component of prevention, absolutely. If we don't work with them, how will he learn? My eyes don't move quick enough to follow all of your answers. Putting the shoe on the responsible foot. Break the cycle, safety and accountability. Absolutely, these are great. It's important to work with men who use violence. Right? And some others just to include, right? And especially in child welfare, right? And that's sort of what we're talking about. You know, we still put women's names on the top of files, right? Even if she isn't the one who's caused the direct harm to the children and it has been the man or the father in that family, right? So we end up making mothers responsible for everything when we don't also work with the person who's using violence. Survivors want us to work with their partners. What we know is that many families stay together. Many families want to try to work it out. They just want to be safe. They want the violence to end, right? And if we're going to do our work in a way that's defined by what victims and survivors want and need, we have to be listening to their desire, right? I can't tell you how many times I sat with people and she's like, can you just sit with him? Can you just tell him what you're telling me? Can you just figure out how to help him so that I can have my family back? Children, right? What we know is that most parents' rights are not terminated. So most parents will have an ongoing relationship with their children. And regardless, many children, even if their parents have done horrific things to them, they want to be with their parents and they want it to be safe, right? So for children, right, to show that people can change, to figure out new strategies to help those who are using violence make different choices. We overlook significant opportunities to increase safety. And that we miss these opportunities to support change and healing. I believe wholeheartedly that everybody has the potential to change. Not everybody changes, and people sometimes have far greater barriers, but that I believe, and I think we all need to find that place in our heart to believe that people can change, right? And so when we provide these opportunities, when we provide a way to work not just to shelter and separate survivors, but to work to reduce violence. I think that as a movement, as a domestic violence movement, this idea of reducing violence as being a key part of what we do is really essential. And I believe wholeheartedly, too, that until we increase our work with people who use violence and that we make it not just battering intervention, or some people use anger management, which we know is it's not about anger, that this is about conscious choices to use power and control in a relationship. But I also think it's about somebody with very limited skills and capacity who, you know, probably had their own experiences of trauma. And it's not to suggest that those things are excuses. But if we don't see the whole person, if we don't see their whole experience, then, you know, I often wondered if I didn't, when visitation, if I didn't see the person sitting in front of me and all of their lived experience, the good, the bad, and that I couldn't see the person and the behavior and separate them out a little bit, I was really ineffective. But when I was able to see a whole person and sort of recognize that this person made some choices that were harmful and did things that weren't okay, but that also had other strengths and talents and assets that we could build on, I had a far greater opportunity to support those opportunities for healing and change. And I think that in our work, healing as a destination is a really important vision and dream for us to have. And we also want to recognize the common characteristics, right? So I think this isn't to negate that there are people who use violence and that they are dangerous and that people die at the hands of their intimate partners. It's not to lose any of those pieces, but it is, and so here, you know, remember like the possessiveness, entitlement, that need to have power and control. And I often want to get under what is that need to have power and control. It's probably someone who feels pretty powerless. Even though, you know, even socially it seems as though they have a lot of power. You know, they often see themselves as the victims, as the person who bad things have happened to. And we certainly don't want to use that as an excuse for their violence, but I think the more we can have an understanding of that, the more able we'd be to connect with people in a way that could facilitate those opportunities for change. And certainly they need to make those changes themselves. We can't change people, but I think we can change the opportunities we provide people to do things different, right? And understanding, right, that this isn't a clinical diagnosis. We want to stay away from sort of pathologizing or thinking that, you know, it's just about fixing the person, that they have a mental health issue, but that this is really about a behavior and that it's learned, right? And that it's learned and supported in many different ways. It's supported in a really micro way, like in relationships on the ground, like our communities, our social systems, as I sort of said, right? Political systems, our social systems, they all support men's entitlement and use of violence. And so we have to recognize that that's at play, and how do we work, you know, both with individuals but also systematically to create those changes. You know, when we're talking about child welfare and we're talking about working with parents, I think it's important to sort of identify some of those key things that we see, right? Continued acts of threats and violence post-separation. What we know about people who use violence when they don't have access to their partner or the person who they're trying to have control over, they will sometimes use their children, right? And often kids get harmed in families where there's domestic violence, not because that parent wants to harm their child, but they're trying to harm their partner, right? And it doesn't make it okay, but I think, again, it's sort of, this is one of those context pieces, right? If we understand that the reason that father, you know, this was common in supervised visitation, chopped off his kid's hair and sent them back after a visit, wasn't to like harm the child, even though the child may have been traumatized, but it was to send a message to that other parent. So the context of that violence has different meaning, you know, that parent intentionally harming that child versus this parent who's willing to use their kid to harm the other parent, right? And what we know about people who use violence in general, they're good under observation. They know they're being watched. Most people can control themselves and make certain decisions knowing that they're being watched, and this is particularly true in supervised visitation, which is why although supervised visitation programs are so important, we have to recognize that there is this artificial setting that most people, and what we do know is that someone in a visitation setting who can't control themselves or be good under observation certainly is an indication that they're most likely going to continue to cause harm to their families outside of that setting. And what we also know is that they use systems, right? And that's where we all need to be working closely together and have a more seamless response, because we get pegged against one another, or we miss ways in which our courts or child protection, I mean, overwhelmingly, we know that people who use violence will threaten or call child protection as a strategy to harm or get at the other parent, knowing that their children are their most sort of precious, kind of loved aspects of their lives. They would do anything, and that they would even stay or make certain choices in order to keep their children with them, right? And that they often try to manipulate, and then in supervised visitation as well. And when they, again, it's this idea of when people who use violence don't have access to the people they're trying to harm, they will use what they can. Sometimes that's their children if they have access to their children, or they'll try to use our systems that are designed to reduce or intervene or interrupt violence as a way to continue to have that power and control. So I see a comment here by Krista, men who batter aren't always bad parents. And I think that's true. I think that at least in my experience in supervised visitation, sitting with dads, they deeply loved their kids. Some of them would travel an hour and a half just to get to the visitation center. And so I think that this is one of those examples of where we can't just sort of lump everything together. Well, certainly it is not safe parenting to harm your partner in a home. It doesn't set an example. It certainly creates some learned lessons for those children. And I think it is also true that men who use violence love their children. And what we have found and what research shows is that sometimes through their children, right, helping men who use violence see the impact of their violence on their children, we can help move the needle for them. We can help engage them in a way to start seeing that, that they're causing harm to their kids and they don't want to harm their kids. We may not get them to care about the violence they're causing to their partners, but we often can get them to care about the impact it's having on their children and help move them in a positive way through that lens. There's this whole conversation happening here in the chat box that I'm trying to keep up with. So keep keep chatting, and if you have questions, feel free to chime in, and Patricia will help bring those questions to my attention. But I'm going to keep going a little bit here. So let's talk a little bit about risk, right? So where we've sort of been as we've looked at some of the myths, kind of understanding some of the misconceptions and some of the things that impact how we intervene and how we think and feel and believe the experiences of survivors, what they look like. We've explored, kind of the importance of working with people who use violence, seeing that reducing violence is as much a part of our job. And I think in order to do that, we also have to see the humanity of people who use violence and recognize that they come with a whole spectrum of experiences that we want to be paying attention to. And that, I would argue, in the spirit of trauma-informed, and we'll talk more about it, like what would a more trauma-informed intervention for people who use violence look like? How might people engage with us in a little different way? I was in a meeting once and someone said, what this one man said in a group was, how can I be held accountable if I don't feel like I count, right? So this idea of, in particular, if we're thinking of communities of color, if we're thinking of people from other marginalized groups, LGBT, undocumented folks, we're trying to hold people accountable, but if you don't feel like you count, if you don't feel like you matter, that people care about you, it's hard to then engage in a system that's designed to stop you from doing what you're doing, but then not always designed to help you then do things better and make different choices and to sort of be there on that journey with you as well. So let's talk a little bit about risks, because I think these are important too, and this ties into this idea of survivors who stay, and as we're working with folks, thinking about the different types of risks, and that safety, a lot of how we've organized ourselves and our interventions is around this idea of safety, right? And is somebody safe? And we've often created the criteria for what that safety is. And what we know is that people's lives are far more complex, and sometimes that physical safety is at the bottom of the scale for them in terms of having their needs met or doing their own risk assessment, right? And so if you think about partner who batters generated risks, right? These are the risks. This is the physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, those risks that are caused by the person who has power and control, is using coercive control in a relationship. So that's one level of risk, and those are often what we're responding to and what we're sort of addressing, and what we often as a system have put at the top of our priority list. But then there's these life-generated risks, and these are things like poverty and racism, mental health, substance use, homelessness, joblessness, all of those other things that are sometimes a part of somebody's life that for many, and I say this for many, meaning many who I've sat with, were far more important. I think of this story when I was a young advocate, and this woman came in, and I was really scared for her. I was scared for her safety. I was scared for what that she just needed. She needed a restraining order in my mind, right? That was the most important thing. That was what was going to keep her safest. But what she was asking me for was food for her kids. She was there with 3 kids, and they were hungry, and she was hungry, and they hadn't eaten. And like for her, like hunger was the greatest risk right now, and that she wanted to feed her kids and herself and have a little peace of mind, right? But I was convinced that she needed a restraining order, and I pushed that restraining order. And I didn't listen, right, to what she was saying was the biggest risk for her in that moment, right? And we ended up losing her. She didn't come back. She didn't sort of follow through because she didn't feel heard. And I prioritized my risk assessment over hers. And I think had I prioritized hers and started where she was at, then we maybe would have gotten to some of these other places that were also relevant in her life. So if we think about risk analysis, right, think about leaving and staying. I'd invite folks to, right, hierarchy of needs. Someone's typing. Thank you, Stephen. What are the risks? What are the risks of leaving, right? If we think about those, what are the risks to a survivor or a victim, right? Retaliation, no money, no home, murder, death, financial instability, losing family support, no support, again, homicide, stalking, uncertainty, emotional stress, loss of kids, hostile isolation from shared parents, unable to care for children, no support, depression, self-blame for a broken family, absolutely, no child care, fear. So now I'd invite us to switch gears a little bit. What are some of the risks of staying? Right? Death, same. Being killed, more abuse, intact family, almost all the same. Danger, child welfare, losing kids, death, immigration status, more emotional harm, mostly the same. Right, so, if I was savvy enough here, I'd be typing these all in as quickly so we could see side by side, right? And I use this, I share this from Jill Davies, right? If we look at these lists of staying or leaving, often the risks, both batter-generated and life-generated, are very similar, right? And I think it's important for us to remember that as we're sitting with someone and we're trying to figure out how to help keep somebody safe, how to support their safety, when we're planning for safety, right, that we acknowledge that the risks for staying are sometimes the same as the risks for leaving, and vice versa. And that this, too, I encourage folks, is something you can do with people while you're sitting with them to help them help you understand how they see their greatest risks, right? You just do a little pros and cons list, right? Stay, right, leave, and ask someone to share with you. What do you see the risks of staying? What do you see the risks of leaving? And then it's right there in front of that person, too. And together you can be in partnership to figure out, how do we plan for your safety? How do we think about what is needed for this family, how to support their safety, what do they need, and really then having the information that comes from the people who we're working with, not the information that we think is most dangerous or most relevant. And what I found was when I was able to start with her list, right, and again, with that person who needs protections list, then my relationship, my ability to support that person, to work with them long term was far greater because we started where she was at. I often say her first, then us, right? And that we could take little steps. I think someone said that here, right? We take those little steps. And then when I have maybe those life-generated risks addressed or taken care of, then maybe I have some more clarity to kind of take on that next piece, right? Which then builds strength and builds those assets and builds that capacity to continue to make choices, to deepen safety in an ongoing way. So I want to talk a little bit about trauma and trauma-informed work, and I struggled with this. And while I think, being trauma-informed is really essential to our work, I sometimes think that we can miss an important piece. And so the slide is just a reminder to all of us, and always to me, that trauma experienced by survivors is the result of the abuse, not the problem. And sometimes when we use just a trauma-informed framework, then we kind of retreat back to this idea of treating or addressing the person and their behavior and what they're doing, and we lose the larger context that this is a large-scale social problem, social issue, and that the trauma, what needs to be addressed is what's causing the trauma. And that if we start by helping reduce the violence, if we help by reducing the things that are causing the trauma in a survivor's life, then we can be more effective then at figuring out what else people need. And then we put the responsibility where it belongs, which is the person who's causing harm. I got an amen there. As opposed to, pathologizing or lumping the person who has experienced violence into a category that is a result of what they're experiencing, not that there's something wrong with them. And so I want to hold this idea of we want to understand the impact of trauma and how we can be sensitive and not re-traumatize folks. But I want to keep us grounded in the reality. Again, I'll just say it one more time before I move, that trauma experienced by survivors is the result of the abuse and is not the problem to be addressed. And I'm open to thoughts and comments about that. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of domestic violence and battering on protective parents. And I would just invite folks to chat in the chat box. What are some of the ways that you've seen domestic violence, the impact of domestic violence on the parents you're working with? What are the things you've seen? I see some typing there. Living in shelters with lots of rules. Destruction of the protective parent self-esteem, absolutely. Mental anguish, hopelessness, no sense of self-respect. Yeah, I think, after becoming a parent, I remember I was a foster parent, and it was like a couple weeks into it, I remember calling my dad, who was a single parent, and just saying, I have so much respect for what it meant to be a single parent of 3 kids, right? And not living in violence and not having all these pieces. But parenting is so challenging, and it's a lot like politics. And so I often think, then parenting under the context of being abused and someone else having coercive power and control, the struggles that happen, right? An inability to focus, an inability to manage. I struggle, and I have a partner who's, active and helpful and loving, and I struggle managing the everyday responsibilities of being a parent. I have so much empathy, right, for the person who's then also living under the guise of abuse and power and control. Sometimes children's emotional and mental health affected by violence, they've seen and experienced, absolutely, right? So we see the impact on children. We see children learn the violence. We see children adapt. We see it affect their brains and their learning and all of those things. Family secrets, absolutely. So let's shift gears a little bit here. And I think, as we remember the impact of DV on parenting, we also recognize that if it impacts parenting, it's also having that similar impact on the person who is being harmed, right? So holding on to that. And that when we think about trauma, I think this is always helpful for me, right? That it's an overwhelming experience for that individual person, right? And so that also reminds us that, again, this ties in that context piece, that not everything impacts everybody the same, right? And that it is traumatic to someone if it is overwhelming to that person. And we all have different strengths and assets and ability to hold different things, resiliency and protective factors. So remembering, right, like this overwhelming thing for that person. And that it might look different for you, for me, but that we've all had an experience, right? And for me, some of this work too is the ways we make connections, not how we find ourselves as different or other than the people who we're working with, but the more we can make connections to our own lived experience and the similarities versus the differences is really helpful for us to being more present and less judgmental. And I think aware of how we're sitting and being with the people who we work with. So the impact of violence that causes trauma for survivors, right? That trauma, it's not just psychological, but it has a physiological impact on people, right? And so we're not just talking about, again, the bruises and the broken bones, but we're talking about the impact it has on somebody's psyche and their overall well-being, right? That when triggered, survivors may not be able to engage in problem solving, right? In the ways that we would want them to. And that we have to recognize that most likely when people are with us in our work, that they are potentially being triggered, that they're still living in this place of the impact of the violence, which is that trauma, so that overwhelming place. And that, we want them to engage with us, and we want them to be able to solve these problems and to make decisions. And while we need people to do that over time, we have to recognize that things don't change overnight, And in running shelters, which I did for a while too, it wasn't long that in the shelter I realized, wow, we're asking people to jump tremendous hurdles and do tremendous things in a short amount of time in a condition that I don't know that I would be able to get out of bed, right? And sort of remembering those pieces. And that feeling safe is critical for healing. And again, remembering that sort of how we define safety may be very different than how somebody else defines safety. So what does safe or safer mean for that person who we're working with? And how do we help get there so that those processes for healing, for resilience can really kick in? And that, you know, this always strikes me, and for each and every one of you, all 344 folks who are on this webinar with us, right? Relationships have been proven to be the most powerful tool, right? So if we think about even the little things we do every day for survivors, for children, for people who use violence, right? That those relationships that we build, that trust, that transparency, that caring, like I believe we need to bring more love into our work and bring our whole hearts, right? Those are the types of things that really make a difference in people's lives. Right? And so when the work feels overwhelming, when you feel hopeless, which I think we've all felt in this work, if we can sometimes just go down to the real core way in which we can support folks, those relationships are so important. And so when we think about social connections, when we think about how we intervene with survivors, with children in our systems, you know, when we think about our plans for safety with people, if we think about how are we helping people get connected, to have relationships, to have support systems, those are the folks who we often see move towards a path of healing. But that when isolation kicks in, when there aren't relationships, when there aren't people we trust or people who we feel care about us, then I think the impact of trauma, the impact of the violence can be more long-lasting. So here are some things that we may see, right? So if you're working with a family, if you're working with a survivor, signs that, you know, the impact of the violence, you know, is present, so the trauma is present, so avoidance. When people aren't willing to engage or participate in the conversation. When they avoid showing up for appointments that seem easy to show up for, or they don't answer the door when we show up for our appointments, for our home visit, for those types of things, right? Recognizing that that avoidance can be a sign for us, an indicator that trauma is present. And it's not that they don't want the help or the support, but that, you know, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of sort of going inward, right? Which sort of ties into this idea of being emotionally numb or disengaged. Sometimes we just shut down. Sometimes our main strategy for survival is to just kind of shut it out, because to feel it, to be in it, is way too overwhelming, is way too much. And then if you think about a parent, if you think about, you know, a mother or a father who's been abused, right, and is trying to care for children, and then we wonder, why aren't they connecting with their children? How come they are being sort of distant? How, you know, that parent is so numb and not feeling the gravity of what's happening. What we might want to think about is, wow, this may be so intense and so overwhelming that this parent has needed to kind of check out a little bit, right, in order to stay even present, right, in the best way that they can. Again, the sort of hyperarousal, sort of the other sort of this easy to aggravate, easy to sort of be triggered or to respond. Powerlessness and helplessness. We feel this, right? And we'll talk a little bit about vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, but I think this happens for those of us who do this work. It's really easy to experience, you know, the story over and over and over again if we're not taking care of ourselves, if we're not aware of our own stuff, our own lived experience, you know, that just feeling helpless, feeling like there's nothing's going to change. And when we feel that, it's hard to engage, it's hard to problem solve, it's hard to see beyond just this moment. And again, these other things around hypervigilance, you know, kind of over watchfulness, not sleeping, kind of a heightened alert to everything, to every bump or noise or thing that happens. People who are very edgy or sort of constantly kind of looking around. If we think, right, so as Stephen said, right, these are signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. And most survivors of domestic violence have some level of PTSD, right? And that's going to show up in all different ways. And so how it may show up in your office or in your courtroom, right? It may compromise a parent's ability to have good judgments, to make the best decisions, right? So maybe it means I don't show up for my court case, or I haven't shown up for my appointment, or I say something that maybe I shouldn't say. It makes it hard to keep and maintain relationships, and that could mean relationships with us, whether we're advocates or social workers or attorneys, or the people in their life who may be offering help. And I think some of this, poor self-esteem, right? Self-worth, that person who walks in is sort of looking down and their shoulders are curved. I mean, I think we can all close our eyes and see the person who, as a result of the violence, is living with trauma, what that looks, feels like when they walk into our office. And they make it challenging to, continue relationships, partner with us, so they're not coming willing, to our doors. And if we can recognize that that's not because they're lazy or not interested or don't care, but that those are signs of the experience of the violence and the trauma, then we can sort of back it up a little and figure out how to take some smaller steps. And again, some of these are the same, right? So it really can impact decision making and choices, ability to make choices. And then it also makes you more vulnerable to stressors. So it could make you more vulnerable to substance use or other behaviors that can cause harm to either the parent or the child. And so we want to remember that the impact, it's like a depleted immune system, right? We're less able to be in the struggle in the way that we as social workers, as advocates, want people to show up. But it's really challenging because, our own self-worth, our own kind of what we need inside of us to sort of get up and fight is impaired as a result of the violence that's been experienced. So the more understanding we have of that, the more empathetic one we can be, and then the more able we are to set up how we work with people, how we partner with people, how we bring them into our offices and into our systems in a much more sensitive way. And so some strategies, right? So moving forward, I'm being mindful of the time. We have about a little over 15 minutes. I want to leave some more time for folks to ask some questions if you have questions. And feel free to type those in as we go too. So partnering with survivors, I think this is key, right? And this ties into relationships. This ties into understanding, that we're here to meet people where they're at. It's like a key tenet of social work, right? Meet people where they're at. And it's really important, especially when working with people who've experienced violence. And I think it's important when working with people who've used violence. We may want them to be at Z, but they may be at A. So let's start where they're at. And that helps us then build trust and get a clearer, truer story maybe along the way, right? But in particular, when supporting survivors, be a partner, right? Know that they bring expertise, they bring strength, they bring survival, they bring in knowledge and information way beyond what we have about their life, right? And then we bring expertise, we bring resources, we bring information, we bring our experiences, and together that partnership can help really move folks to being safer and ideally to a place where healing can happen. Supporting them in their self-determination, letting them lead, letting them help, guide the process, within our rules and guidelines and all of the things that we're held to, laws and whatnot. But how do we really help survivors be empowered to lead the partnership, right? Show that we're not judgmental. Show that we're human, those things that we can share about ourselves that make us, more similar than different again. I think these make a difference. We seem, more that our lives are perfect. And what we know is that we all have our own lived experience. And so however we can support without judgment, show that non-judgment, and show our own or the decision making. Absolutely. Like they are key decisions that are going to be made. Because when we make decisions, people set in not long term. But when you're a part of the process, when you feel like you have input, when you feel especially when it's your life, your family, the more we can do that, right? Provide options are a funny thing when we're talking about survivors of domestic violence. I see that maybe we're having a little audio problem. Someone let me know if that's a little bit better. So providing options and choices. You know, options are a funny thing, like I said. What seems like an option may not really feel like an option, but it may just be as good as it gets for right now, right? And when you're choosing between the person who you love and care about and your children, or living in a house, or living on the street, or having all your needs met or not, I mean, those are the options and choices sometimes that we provide that are available to survivors. And recognizing that maybe they have some options or choices that they would like to offer up as part of our decision making, as part of our planning for their safety with them. And sometimes, you know, Caitlin, I'm reading your comment. I feel like sometimes it can be difficult to empower survivors because the person who they've loved for so long and trusted has now hurt them. And so all of a sudden we think they're just going to trust us, right? We're a total stranger. And for some of us, if we're in child welfare or we're in other, you know, positions where we have some power to remove children or to make those choices, you know, it's those relationships are hard to build. And to just assume that they're going to trust us, I think, is a really dangerous place to start. We have to earn that trust, and we earn that by being transparent. We earn that by being human. We earn that by, you know, following through, and we earn that by, you know, sometimes having to make those hard decisions. But, you know, really building that trust is key, and recognizing that that may take a long time because, you know, I always say when I do training for supervised visitation programs, well, the providers in the room seem like perfectly lovely people. The idea of handing my child over to you to be with the person who's caused such harm to me is a big choice and isn't easy, and it's going to take some time for me to trust you, right? And that we must do our own work and practice self-care. And this is essential. We have to know who we are and what we bring. We have to know when we're having a good day versus a bad day. We have to know when we feel like we can show up with our whole selves, or when maybe we need some backup or support from the people who we're working with. Because when we fake it or when we try to make it work, that shows up in how we're building relationships, how people see us, and our ability to be really present. And so I think it's so essential that we do our own work in this process, and that we allow space for our own feelings and our own, you know, judgments to come about so we can talk about them and work through them. It makes us better and, you know, more trustworthy, and I think more effective in our partnerships with families. And again, here's some more tips. Build on her strengths, develop empathetic connections, understanding, sort of recognizing how hard this might be. Building on positive cultural models and support, recognizing that culture is such a key protective factor for kids and for adults, and that where people come from and understanding, you know, not only maybe the trauma they've experienced in their relationships, but the trauma they experience in their community or the historical trauma for many communities, like recognizing the impact that has on people's lives is so important. And then the power dynamic that comes into play as for us as professionals in those communities with those folks, and the ways in which it may be different or from some of the other families we might work with. Working to improve not just safety but well-being, right? So someone's whole self, not just that they feel physically safe right now, but all of the other aspects of who they are and their well-being are so essential to be paying attention to. And trying to build up so that, you know, as she's making choices in her life, she feels support. She feels that, you know, we're not just looking at the places where she's been harmed or the trauma she's experienced or the violence she's experienced, but that we're building on, you know, the tremendous other things she does, whether it's being a parent or in the community, her own activism, her own successes, her own, all of those other things that are also present in the families who we're working with. And sort of last, well, not totally last, but a place that I think is important for us to recognize is kind of the impact that it has on us, right? And that secondary post-traumatic stress is the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about firsthand trauma experiences, right? And that sometimes that impact can be as impactful as having the experience yourself. And that those of us who sit and listen to stories, those of us who hold people's lived experience, so important that we recognize the impact that has on us. I remember working somewhere and talking to the person who took our crisis line, and that's all she did. 8 hours a day, she answered crisis calls, and I couldn't help but think, like, how do you hold that every single day, you know? And you start to see the ways in which we start to minimize stories, or we lump them all together, and we lose our compassion and our empathy as our own self-protection. And then we burn out. And if there's nothing else that folks, right, see a therapist, talk to people, get support, our organizations, right, like organizationally, we need to set up ways that we're supporting staff. You know, for individual staff and workers, I encourage you to have a self-care partner who you hold each other responsible for doing the things that take care of you so that you can keep doing this work. Because I think one of the biggest issues in child welfare and DV advocacy and a lot of our work with survivors and families is turnover, right? Because we burn out, because we can't, it's because of the secondary stress, because of our compassion fatigue. So what we do to kind of nurture ourselves is so important as a way to sustain our work and to be, you know, in better partnership with the folks who we're working with and to create those opportunities for change. So you, each and every one of you, all 329 of you, are as important as the people who you work with every single day. So think about, what do you do to nurture your own self, to do your own self-reflection, to take care of you and to take care of the people around you so that you can stick around and keep doing this work. Because we need all of us out there working to create change and safety for individuals, families, and our communities. Again, so these are just some of my notes on that, right? It's just important. And celebrate successes. Every day, gratitude. Those types of things really make a difference, right? And supportive supervision is essential. We need to have supervision from folks who are understanding and empathetic. I did a listening session recently with a social worker who talked about being mocked by their supervisor, and that was so profound for me. Like, brought vulnerability, brought the impact of this experience, and then was mocked by the very person who needed that support from. The impact of that is long-lasting and so important. That our supervision is supportive, and that we find ways to take care of ourselves and each other, right, with love and gratitude as we keep doing this work. So I come back to this moment of self-reflection, and I invite folks, as you're thinking about our conversation today, I can't wait to sort of read through the chat because there was obviously some other really fantastic conversations happening. And I'm going to move from the slide, but I invite folks, when we hang up from this webinar, to think about, you know, has anything shifted in terms of your shoulds? Is there anything shifted in terms of maybe some new beliefs or new understanding that you might have about survivors, about children, about people who use violence? And then how that might shift how you do your work. And that I would invite folks for your questions right now, and so to describe, you know, what is one thing, one way you can shift your work, your practice, the way you are with survivors and people who use violence and children as a result of something that struck me today in our conversation. Ellen says, ask them what they need now, today, right? So like right now, what can I do? Ask them their current priorities and needs. Be more cognizant of cultural supports, absolutely. Good listener. Center around survivors' needs. Again, listening. Really listen. Ronnie, I appreciate that. So not just, you know, we hear, but like, what does it mean to really listen to what someone is saying? Empathy, not sympathy. Patience. Scott, absolutely. Patience. Recognizing this isn't a short journey, right? This is the marathon. This is a long haul. This is changing beliefs and behaviors and experiences that people have sometimes been having since they were young. Doesn't change overnight. No coulda, shoulda, woulda. Yep. Thanks for that, Judy. Don't pass judgment. Yep. And each of these, each of these are things that as soon as we hang up, in the next 5 minutes can shift or change. And I guarantee you will change how people experience you, survivors, children, people who use violence. Can help shift the people around you who maybe hold some of these myths or misconceptions to have a different understanding, and can help us keep moving our work forward in a really important way. You're not a failure. Yep. Involved in all decision making. Volunteer. The Rachel video, yep, it's for purchase. Reach out to Praxis. They may have ways to help you with that. I see some more folks typing. Look them in the eye. Boost self-confidence. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for these comments. Thanks for the work that you do. I know when you call into these webinars, your phone still rings, your emails keep coming in, your clients and the people who you work with, participants, are still needing your support and services. And I feel like taking this time out for you to learn and reflect is really as important as the work that you do. I want to appreciate each of you for the work that you do. This is not easy work. And I know that we all bring our whole selves, our whole hearts, our whole minds to what we do every day with families. And I just want to have a moment of gratitude for that and appreciate you being here with us today. I do want to do a quick plug. There is some work happening. The Children's Bureau has funded a quality improvement center on domestic violence and child welfare, and that effort is being led by Futures Without Violence. And I just encourage folks to keep an eye out. There's going to be some demonstration work coming, looking for communities who want to really enhance the work with families experiencing domestic violence and child welfare. And so folks should keep an eye out for that. We'd love to have you involved, and hopefully some new resources and ongoing training and support to all of you in the field to keep moving this work forward. So thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed being here with you, and best of luck in your work. Take good care. I do believe that we, I don't know if Patricia or Elizabeth, anyone has some final words. I know there is an evaluation that will come up, and maybe Patricia will tell you about that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jen. So just as a reminder, a brief survey will appear on your screen after I end the meeting in just a few moments. If for any reason the survey does not automatically come up for you, feel free to enter the room again using the same link, and you can actually retrieve this survey via the web links box. And I can also copy and paste it in the chat box as well. And if you'd like to get a certificate of attendance for this webinar event, you can do so by completing the evaluation. So thank you again for participating, everyone, and have a great day. Thanks so much, Jen.
Thank you.